The sky above Richmond was a flawless shade of blue, as if it too had been instructed to behave for the cameras. A string quartet played on the State House steps, while donors, dignitaries, and political veterans lined the marble walk, each waiting for their moment to shake the hand of the newly elected governor, my brother Julian Devereux. He wore the role well. Crisp navy suit, confident smile, a practiced humility that read clean through a dozen microphones. Cameras flashed as he waved to the crowd and placed a hand over his heart like he was pledging allegiance not just to the flag, but to the image of himself he'd been building for years. Our parents, Charles and Meredith, stood behind him, statues of elegance and influence, absorbing the applause like solar panels drawing power. I stood to the side close enough for the press to capture the Devereux family unity, far enough to feel the distance in my chest. This was our family's moment, the crown jewel in a legacy carefully crafted over decades. But even as Julian took the oath, his voice clear and unwavering, I couldn't shake the dull throb just under my ribs. I'd spent my whole life surrounded by performances, and today felt like the most polished of them all. My wife Elena stood next to me in a dark green coat, her posture still her expression unreadable. She wasn't watching Julian. Her eyes were scanning the crowd, subtle, quiet, but alert. She noticed details others missed, always had. Years in journalism had trained her well. While the rest of us posed, Elena observed. When the ceremony ended, we walked together into the rotunda for the private reception. Crystal glasses clinked under the vaulted ceilings. Someone from the mayor's office raised a toast to vision leadership and the strength of brotherhood. My parents beamed. Julian laughed the way only he could, warm, commanding, camera-ready. I watched him work the room like it belonged to him, and maybe it did. He had the charm, the rhetoric, the hunger. I'd always had the clean-up jobs. Elena's hand touched my arm lightly. "Something's off," she said so quietly I barely heard her over the music. I turned to look at her, but she was already glancing away, the glass in her hand untouched. A moment later, as my parents laughed beside Julian and the crowd pressed closer to congratulate him, she leaned in again. Her lips were inches from my ear. "We need to leave. Now." I stared at her, waiting for a smirk, a hint that she was joking. None came. What I asked, but my voice was swallowed by the room laughter, clinking glasses, the echo of some senator telling a war story near the bar. Elena didn't repeat herself. She just held my gaze, steady and calm, the way she did when she knew more than she was ready to say. "Is something wrong?" I asked again, lowering my voice. She tilted her head slightly toward the far side of the rotunda, toward a man in a charcoal-gray suit, speaking with Julian. I didn't recognize him. Elena didn't explain. Her eyes flicked back to mine. "You really didn't notice?" There was no accusation in her tone, just quiet disbelief. And somehow that cut deeper. I followed her line of sight again, trying to make sense of what I was supposed to see. Julian always animated threw his head back in a generous laugh. The man in gray leaned in closer, said something, and Julian nodded without hesitation. It could have been nothing. A donor, a handler, someone from the campaign team. But Elena's instincts were rarely wrong. "Elena, I don't know what you think is happening," I said. "I know," she replied. "That's the problem." I looked around the room. My parents were basking, as always, in their son's spotlight. The lieutenant governor was shaking hands with a Wall Street executive. Everyone looked like they belonged, like everything was under control. But now, with Elena's voice still in my head, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just been pulled off a stage mid-scene without realizing the curtain had fallen. She took a slow sip from her glass, then leaned closer again. "We can't talk here. Not yet." And just like that, the party around me continued, but I wasn't in it anymore. I was somewhere else entirely, following her eyes and wondering how much of this night was real and how much had already been rehearsed. We stepped out onto a side terrace away from the noise, the cameras, the toasts, to legacy and leadership. The night air was crisp, a cold breath against the back of my neck. Elena crossed her arms, her coat still open, as if the chill didn't touch her. "Talk to me," I said. She hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but caution. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone, tapping the screen a few times before handing it to me. "This," she said, "is from a friend of mine who still runs data compliance for one of the watchdog groups. Someone flagged the donation records from Julian's PAC. Dozens of transactions, small amounts, routed through different shell entities. Nothing illegal on paper, but deliberately structured to stay just below reporting thresholds." I scanned the spreadsheet on the screen. Names that meant nothing. Addresses that didn't exist. I felt the first crack, not big enough to collapse anything, but enough to hear something shift. "That doesn't prove anything," I said. "Could be clerical. Could be the finance team managing optics." Elena gave me a look, one I'd learned to recognize years ago. Not judgment, not pity, just disappointment, quiet and tired. She took the phone back and swiped again. "This is from the campaign server, or what's left of it. Someone tried to wipe everything post-election, but they missed fragments. Email headers, mostly. Enough to show direct communication between Julian's chief of staff and a reporter who was working a story on a sexual misconduct allegation. The story never ran. I closed my eyes for a beat, feeling the weight of that word allegation tighten in my chest. "You're saying he paid someone off?" I asked. "I'm saying," she replied, "that a 19-year-old intern was reassigned out of state after a closed-door meeting with Julian. And the campaign called in a crisis consultant that same week." I leaned against the stone railing. "If any of this is true, it is." "Elena?" I shook my head. "He's not stupid. He wouldn't. He's not stupid." She cut in, "but he's protected. There's a difference." I looked back through the tall windows at Julian, still surrounded by admirers, holding court like a born king. He caught my eye for a second and smiled, raised his glass. I forced a nod. "I know what this family means to you," Elena said gently, "but it's time you asked yourself what it's built on." I didn't answer. Not yet. But something in me was beginning to loosen like a knot tied too tight for too long. Inside, they were announcing the next round of speeches. Our cue to return. I straightened my jacket and followed her in, but I wasn't sure which version of myself I was bringing back through those doors. I've always known how to disappear without leaving the room. It's something you learn early in families like mine. The ability to smile through discomfort, to laugh when you want to scream, to fade into the background, so the image at the center, shining, spotless, presidential, remains untouched. I was 8 the first time I took the blame for Julian. He'd broken the antique clock in my father's study. One of those old ugly things imported from somewhere expensive, perched on the mantel like a warning. We weren't even supposed to be in the room. Julian had dared me to climb the shelves. I refused. Then he did it himself and knocked the clock down with a triumphant laugh. The crash echoed through the house. When my father stormed in, his rage already fully formed, Julian looked at me without a word, and I stepped forward. I did it. He didn't ask twice. That night I sat with an ice pack on my back while Julian watched cartoons downstairs eating dessert. When he passed me in the hallway later, he grinned and said, "Thanks, man," like it was a game, like that was just how things worked. By the time we were in college, the stakes were higher. Julian had gotten involved with a professor's daughter, late-night parties, leaked photos, a whispered rumor that he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. My parents flew out to the campus the same day the dean requested a formal meeting. Julian was calm, unbothered. I was the one pacing the dorm hallway, tying and retying my tie. "We'll say it was a prank," my father had said. "Boys get carried away." "Graham, you were there, weren't you?" "I wasn't." But I said I was. The university dropped the disciplinary review. The girl withdrew a week later. No charges were filed. When we got home, my mother hugged Julian and said, "Next time, be more careful." There were always next times. A DUI scrubbed clean before the morning papers. A fundraising dinner scandal rebranded as miscommunication. My parents called it strategy. I called it silence. And I lived in that silence. I made a life in it. I took the job managing the Devereaux family. Trust stayed out of the spotlight, learned to nod and reassure, to frame the story before anyone else could. Julian was the public face. I was the quiet architect behind him, building the scaffolding that kept his image intact. I told myself it was loyalty. That's what families do. But standing on that terrace listening to Elena lay out what she'd found, I began to feel the full weight of it. Not just the lie Julian might be telling now, but the lie I'd helped build since we were kids. Brick by brick, word by word. I looked at her, really looked at her, and wondered if she saw what I was finally seeing, that this wasn't about one moment, one scandal. It was the system we'd all agreed to keep alive. She slipped her hand into mine without saying anything. Her fingers were cold, steady. Inside, Julian was being called to the stage again. My mother's voice echoed off the marble. "Everyone please welcome the man of the hour, our son, our governor, Julian Devereaux." I let go of Elena's hand and followed the applause. But something inside me didn't move. Something stayed behind, still standing out there in the cold, waiting for the truth to catch up. The car ride home was quiet. Elena didn't push. She never did. She knew how I processed things slowly, privately, trying to organize what I felt into something that wouldn't knock me over. It was well past midnight when we reached the apartment. The city was still glowing but quieter now, the noise of celebration replaced by the steady hum of streetlights and distant sirens. I loosened my tie and sat down on the couch, elbows on knees, trying to slow my thoughts. She handed me a folder. "I wasn't going to show you tonight," she said, "but after everything you saw, what I saw, I think you need to look." I didn't answer. I just opened it. The first page was a copy of a police report filed 18 months ago in Alexandria. The complainant was listed as anonymous. The narrative was brief, clinical, an unnamed female staffer alleging inappropriate contact during a late-night meeting at a campaign apartment. No evidence collected, no follow-up. I turned the page. An email from Julian's chief of staff to the campaign's legal counsel. "We need this buried, no leaks. She wants to avoid press. Name your number." Then came a payment record. $50,000 transferred from a third-party law firm to a private bank account registered under a pseudonym. A separate note in handwritten script, non-disclosure agreement signed. I kept reading. A typed statement, one paragraph. The girl's voice, buried beneath formal language and softened phrasing, was still there. She said she didn't want to go public, that she felt pressured to stay quiet and just wanted to move on. Her signature was at the bottom. No date. My hands felt cold. The pages blurred slightly as I blinked. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. Elena sat across from me, not speaking. I closed the folder and held it in my lap like it was something radioactive. My chest ached, not from shock, but from recognition. The silence around Julian had always been thick, dense enough to hide anything. But this was no longer suggestion, no longer whispers. This was real. "He knew," I said finally. "Yes. And our parents, I don't know if they know all of it, but they knew enough." I nodded slowly, the nausea rising. I stood and walked to the window, staring down at the empty street. Somewhere in that stillness it sank in fully, this wasn't one mistake. This wasn't some youthful recklessness. This was something darker, something I'd helped protect. Elena walked over and stood beside me. This isn't just your brother's shame, Graham. It's the family's, and it's yours if you let it be. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. Not yet. I spent my whole life making sure he never fell, I said, and he used that, all of it. She touched my arm gently, then stopped holding him up. The silence between us wasn't cold, it was waiting. Something had shifted, not just in what I knew, but in who I could keep pretending to be. I turned back toward the room, toward the folder still sitting on the table, and finally saw it not as a threat, but as a door, one I could choose to walk through or close forever. I wasn't sure which yet, but I knew I couldn't unsee it. The next morning, Julian called. He wanted to meet at the club, the one downtown with the heavy oak doors and the hush-money wallpaper. We'd been going there since we were kids, back when we wore matching ties and watched our father shake hands with men who decided the price of silence over drinks. Julian was already in the back room when I arrived, lounging in a leather armchair like he had all the time in the world. A decanter of scotch sat on the table between us, untouched. "I figured you'd be calling," he said, grinning. "Didn't think you'd bring it to me this fast, though. I didn't sit. You paid her off." He tilted his head, pretending to think. "Paid who off exactly?" I didn't answer. I reached into my coat and set the folder on the table. "You want to pretend this is nothing, go ahead. But don't insult me by acting surprised." Julian exhaled slowly, the smile slipping just a little. "You read it all enough." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Look, Graham, I didn't hurt her. I didn't touch her. She was upset. And people like that young under pressure, they make things up when they feel cornered. I gave her an out. That's all. That's what you're calling it, an out." He shrugged. "She signed. She took the money. No one forced her." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the brother I grew up with and the man sitting in front of me now. The problem was, I'd spent too long giving him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't know where one version ended and the other began. "You want to play hero now?" Julian asked, reading my silence. "You who stayed quiet every time it was convenient. You think you're better than me because you didn't make the mess. You still live off the name. You still let them use you to hold the damn scaffolding up." The door opened behind me. Elena stepped in. She didn't speak right away, just walked to the table and set down a second envelope. "She didn't make it up," she said. "And she didn't want a payout. She wanted to be heard. When she realized no one would listen, she took what she could." Julian looked between us, expression hardening. "I don't know what game you two think you're playing," he said. "This isn't a game," I replied. "Not anymore." His jaw flexed, but he said nothing. I turned to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back. "This isn't over, Julian." He didn't follow me. Outside, Elena waited beside me as I exhaled the cold air burning in my lungs. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing with certainty. We couldn't stay silent anymore. We slipped out through the service exit, past the kitchen staff, still clearing champagne flutes and empty plates. No one noticed. No one ever noticed people who weren't clapping. Outside, the night was wide and cold. Across the lawn, the celebration roared on glasses, raised laughter sharp in the air. Then came the first fireworks streaking into the sky like a promise, bursting in brilliant gold. The crowd erupted in applause. Elena stood beside me, coat drawn, tight eyes on the horizon. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My throat felt raw with restraint. Another firework exploded overhead, blue this time, trailing sparks that rained over the governor's tent. Julian was in there somewhere, smiling, shaking hands, basking in a victory that had been bought with silence. With mine, I watched the sky burn in colors that didn't feel like celebration anymore. They felt like warning flares, signals from a ship that had drifted too far from shore. "We're not done," I said quietly. Elena didn't speak, but I felt her nod beside me. I wasn't naive enough to think the truth could be dropped like a stone and expected to land clean. Not tonight. Not in front of donors and cameras and a press corps already sharpening their stories. But eventually it would come. When the time was right, when the facts were lined up like dominoes, then we would push. And when it fell, it wouldn't just be Julian caught in the collapse. It would be the name itself, the family, the brand we were all taught to protect like sacred ground. The crowd behind us cheered again as the sky lit up one final time in red and gold. I turned away. There was still work to do. 2 weeks later, the headlines had moved on. Julian's inauguration photos were still circulating his approval numbers, holding steady the public narrative as polished as ever. Nothing had cracked yet, not outwardly. But beneath it, something had begun. Elena and I started making quiet calls, not to reporters, not yet, to people who understood how stories like this got buried, lawyers, former staffers, one woman who used to work in crisis PR and now ran a nonprofit for whistleblowers. They all said the same thing: truth needed structure, a plan, protection. I found myself spending hours in front of a whiteboard, sketching out the bones of something I wasn't even sure I had the strength to build. A foundation, maybe. Something that could give voice to people who'd been silenced the way she had. Not to destroy my brother, but to make sure what happened to her didn't happen again. Or if it did, that it wouldn't go unheard. I'd spent my whole life protecting a name, a legacy. But legacy meant nothing if it was built on silence. Elena sat across from me one night as I outlined the first proposal. She didn't say much, just listened, nodded, wrote down the names I couldn't bring myself to call. I didn't know what the next step would look like, only that it wouldn't be retreat. Not this time. Would you choose loyalty over justice? If exposing your brother meant ending your legacy, would you do it? How long can truth wait before it rots inside you?